Shavuot Tov Rabotai. We are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Sheviit. We're up to Perek Chet Mishnah Aleph. Today's Mishnah should be Le'Nishmat Neria Ben Svetlana Aranbad Menuchato Began Eden. Amen. The Mishnah today returns to the discussion about Shemitah produce that was used improperly. The Mishnah says, Mechatz Shusika Beteven Obika Shel Sheviit. If water in a bathhouse was heated by burning straw or stubble that had Shemitah sanctity, mutar lechotzba, one is permitted to bathe in the bathhouse, because even though the straw should have not been used to fuel the fire, a person can bathe there because he's not benefiting directly from the improper use of the straw. And the Mefarshim explain, straw and stubble are the inedible parts of the stalk of a stalk of grain. Since they can be eaten by animals, they can have Shemitah sanctity. Now, Shemitah produce can be used to fuel a fire only if it's a type of produce that is reserved for that purpose. But here, since the straw and stubble are reserved for animal food, they cannot be used as fuel for a fire. So why is the Mishnah saying that if straw or stubble of Shemitah sanctity was used to fuel a fire and heat up water, are you allowed to bathe in that water? Because the Mefarshim explain, a person who bathes in water that was heated by the straw and stubble that contain Shemitah sanctity, he is not misusing the straw because the straw had already been burned. He's simply benefiting from the water that was heated illegally, unlawfully, and therefore such indirect benefit is mutar. Now the Mefarshim point out that the bathhouse attendant, who burned the straw, he is penalized for misusing the Shemitah produce, like we spoke about more in Mishnah Chet. The Mishnah continues, V'mitchashevhu, but if he's a respected person, a Torah scholar, that others learn from his actions, that the Mefarshim explain, because he has this more, people assume that if he does something, it must be permitted. The Mishnah says, Areze lo yechotz. He may not bathe there because if people see him bathing, they might assume that you were allowed to use Shemitah straw as fuel. They won't realize that he didn't actually use it as the fuel, but he was bathing there only because it had already been burned by somebody else. They'll think it's allowed to do lechatchila and to begin with, ideally, and therefore he would not be allowed to bathe in such water because people might make the wrong assumption and they will think that he did it lechatchila. That is in Rabotai Mishnah Yud Aleph and Perek Chet. Perek Tet now begins discussing, like we learned several times, a person who owns land in Eretz Yisrael, he is obligated to let people enter his property during Shemitah and take whatever is growing there. If an owner protects his field to prevent people from entering by, for example, locking the front gate, he has violated this mitzvah of allowing people to come and take the produce during the Shemitah year. On top of that, it is asur to buy produce from someone who protected the field, because then that would support his unlawful act. He knows that he benefits. I'll lock my field, then I'll sell my produce. Therefore, in the Mishnah, we learned that you are not allowed to buy produce from a person that unlawfully guarded his produce on Shemitah. Now, ignorant people who are suspected of not observing the laws of Shemitah properly, we would therefore not be allowed to buy most species of produce from them, because we assume they unlawfully guarded it. But today's Mishnah in Perek Tet Mishnah Aleph lists 6 species that are an exception to this rule, and it explains why. The Mishnah says, Hapegam, Vayarbuzin, Ashotim, והחלגלוגות, כוסבר שבהרים, והכרפס שבנהרות, והגרגר של עפר, rue, wild asparagus, porcelain, mountain coriander, river celery, and meadow rocket. Pituin mina ma'asrot, they are exempt from tithes, meaning the terumot and ma'asrot, even in non-Shemitah years. V'nilkachin mikol adam b'shviit, and they can be bought from any person, even in Amaretz during Shemitah. Shen keyotze behem nishmar, because no vegetable like these is protected by the owner. And then Mefarshim explain, if you notice, we specifically listed wild asparagus, mountain coriander, river celery, meadow rocket, as opposed to the variety of these vegetables that are cultivated in gardens, because the Mishnah's ruling does not apply to garden varieties. They're more valuable and they would not be abandoned by their owners. But in these specific six species of produce, since they are worth so little, their owner would abandon them and he would give up the rights of ownership. He wouldn't break the law and guard them unlawfully. Now, since they are ownerless, because the owner already abandoned them and he gives up the right of ownership, they are exempt from Terumot and Maasrot even in non-Shemitah years. And since they are worth so little, a person can buy them from an Am Haaretz on Shemitah because he would not guard them illegally. Now the Rav points out to us, and Mefarshim explain, we learn out from Psukim in the Torah that the obligation to separate Terumot and Maasrot does not apply to produce that's hefker, ownerless. Obviously, the Mishnah's ruling is only relevant in non-Shemitah years because during the Shemitah year itself, all produce is exempt from tithes, not only the 6 species here, but the Mishnah is telling us that these 6 species will always be exempt from Terumot and Maasrot on any of the other 6 years. And the Mishnah told us, since these items are worth so little, a person can buy them from an Am Haaretz and Shemitah because we don't assume that he guarded them illegally. Now, even though these abandoned species can be purchased from an Am Haaretz, they are still Shemitah produce and they still have to be treated with Shemitah sanctity, meaning they have to be eaten or used for purposes similar for eating and they cannot be wasted or used for business. Now, the Rav does point out to us that the money received from the sale of Shemitah produce acquires the sanctity of the produce and therefore would be subject to the same laws. Amei Haratzot, however, who cannot be trusted to observe the laws of Shemitah, they might use the money for a prohibited purpose. Therefore, the Chachamim, they limited the amount of money you can pay to an Am Haaretz for Shemitah produce to the value of only 3 meals. Because since this is the amount needed for 1 day's worth of food, we assume that the Am Haaretz will use it to buy food as the law requires, and he will not use it illegally. The Mishnah now moves on to another topic known as Sefichin, right? There's a rabbinic isur prohibition against eating Sefichin. Sefichin are aftergrowths. What are aftergrowths? Aftergrowths are plants that grew from the seeds that fell from the crop of the 6th year. So since they were not illegally planted on Shemitah, these plants would be mutar from the Torah. The Chachamim, however, were concerned that people might unlawfully plant crops on Shemitah and then claim that whatever grew is the aftergrowth of the 6 years crop. So to prevent this, the Chachamim decreed that all aftergrowths, all Sefichin are forbidden. And the Mishnah now is going to give us 3 opinions as to which species are included in the rabbinic decree. We are going to read this Mishnah not following the Rav, following the other Mefarshim, the Rosh and the Rambam in his commentary. The Rav explains it differently, but we're going to follow the other way of the Mefarshim, the Rambam and the Rosh and the Rash's way to learn it. So the Mishnah says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Sefichei chardal mutarin, aftergrowths of mustard are permitted. Shelo nechshedu alehen ovrei avera. Why? Because even lawbreakers are not suspected regarding them, meaning even people who plant crops during Shemitah, they would not cultivate mustard plants because they're of little value. So since the Chachamim forbade aftergrowths only to prevent people from illegally planting during Shemitah and then claiming that it grew from the previous year's harvest, the decree would not apply to mustard seeds, which are worth so little that people would not break the law to plant them. All the species, however, according to Rabbi Yehuda, are included in the decree. It's only by the aftergrowths of mustard. Rabbi Shimon says, Kol ha-sefichin mutarin. He says the exact opposite of Rabbi Yehuda. All aftergrowths are permitted, chutz except misfichei kiruv, except for the aftergrowths of cabbage, she'en keyotzeh behem bi'alkot sadeh, the likes of which are not found among vegetables in the field. And the Mefarshim explain, aftergrowths of cabbage, they look the same as cabbages that were planted, that were deliberately planted. So somebody could technically plant, what he would do, he could plant cabbage illegally on Shemitah and then claim that it's just an aftergrowth. Therefore, the Chachamim prohibited aftergrowths of cabbages. But regarding all other vegetables, a person could not pretend that what he planted is an aftergrowth because vegetables planted deliberately are bigger and healthier than aftergrowths which grow accidentally. Therefore, there would be no reason to ban any other aftergrowths except the aftergrowths of cabbage. The Chachamim Omrim, but the sages say, Kol ha-sefichin asurin, all aftergrowths are forbidden without exception. The Mefarshim explain, in theory, technically, the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Shimon that there was no reason to forbid aftergrowths of anything except cabbage. However, the Chachamim said that they were concerned if the aftergrowths of other species would be allowed, it would undermine the necessary decree against eating cabbage aftergrowths. Therefore, they prohibited all aftergrowths. And that is in Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.